Good after. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here. Let me just welcome all of you to something that is historic. We made history this weekend, literally made history, and made history in more than in one way. And you all, by attending this afternoon, are part of that history. So for those of you who don't know what happened, just very briefly, and we'll get more detail on this in just a second, but yesterday we interviewed through Voces and Maggie's program of Voces. We did oral histories of 11 Latino filmmakers, programmers, and executives. And it was the first time that anything like that had ever been attempted and completed on such a scale. And then, you know, Maggie thought that we needed to have a roundtable like this to share some of the insights of our guests. And to you know, bring you all into the conversation and spread the word. So we made oral history, and they volunteered to share their lives with us, their careers in Latino filmmaking. And we also made kind of oral history by doing something like this that had never been done before. There had been individual interviews here and there of some of these people and some of the Latino filmmakers, but never on this scale and never in a way to make it publicly accessible. So eventually, those interviews that we did, you're going to see available for you through the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American collection here at the University of Texas. So it's something that we're collecting and then we want to share. So I just want to give you that background. And I also want to do, thank you, a series of thank yous for all the help that we needed to have to make this happen. So is it these?
Yeah, so starting off with our staff, Brenna Huang, Omar Rodriguez, who does social media, Andres Torres, who does the videography, and then we have a slew of volunteers, and they are Bismarck Andino. Eli Reed is our photographer. You'll be seeing him. He's kind of a little bit kind of a super volunteer.
He's not just a photographer. He is a magnum photographer. I'm not sure if you know what that means, but in the world of photography, it means he's a photographer's photographer. He is way up there, and deservedly so. And he's been volunteering and recording Voces events for a long time now. So I just wanted to point out that.
Susie Blandon, Micah Rodriguez, Cynthia Miranda, Summer Rizzo, Carlos Anchonda, Janan Taja, and Abigail Arredondo. So these folks yesterday were working their tails off from very early in the morning, at 8 o'clock in the morning, until pretty late last night. So thank you to all of them. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about Voces. I think a lot of people here here today know a little bit about Voces, but for some people who don't know, I'll give you a little bit of a background. We started 19 years ago. Next year we'll be celebrating our 20th anniversary. And we started with Latinos and Latinas of the World War II generation. That was an important period for Latinos because this generation opened a lot of doors for people that came later, including myself. This generation of people tore down a lot of barriers that had existed for Latinos before then. So that's why we started off with World War II. We have now expanded to the Korean and Vietnam War generation, and then a lot more to political and civic engagement. We also have accepted interviews from others, and documentary film producer Jesus Trevino has been one of the people who donated a bunch of his interview tapes, as well as some scholars. So as a result of all that, we have over 1,200 interviews that are housed at the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American Collection, and over 10,000 photographs that have been digitized at high resolution. They get used in documentaries, in exhibits, in books. We've produced 5 books. We have a journal the U.S. Latina and Latino Oral History Journal for academics, and we're an ongoing project. Today's event actually comes out of the World War II period. In 2007, we found out that PBS was going to air a Ken Burns documentary called The War, about World War II and what it was like in the United States. We found out before it aired, the year before it aired, we found out that it included no Latinos. There were no Latino voices in it. And as a result of that, because we knew, and we tried, and we tried to intercede and to get him to include Latinos. And at the beginning, he refused to do so. PBS says it's artistic license. And we were part of a big national campaign to try to include Latinos in that documentary. As a result of that, they hired Hector Galan to do a couple of interviews with Latino veterans, and also one with a Native American. But for us, it really raised a lot of questions, because the whole issue of Latino representation in documentary film and the role that documentary film plays in our society were really brought home to us in a way. We knew what the truth was because we had the photographs of our parents and our grandparents and our aunts and uncles on our mantles at home. And we respected them a great deal. And so when they came back and said they weren't part of the universal story, it made us really stop and think about, how do Latinos get woven into the national historical narrative, but then how can we make a difference with documentary film? Last year we did a 10-year anniversary of the event, and we learned that we looked at what had changed, what had not changed. And as a result of that, this is what you see today. And so we're really proud to have everybody here today. And I'd like to, if we could, start off with just getting them to introduce themselves. Sure. Can I get y'all to just introduce yourself and just pass the microphone around?
My name is Alan Dominguez. I am a filmmaker from Denver, Colorado.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Did you hear it?
Is it green? Did you all hear it? Front or on the back? Is the back one green?
Just say test.
Take this one, Scott.
Hi. There you go. My name is Alan Dominguez. I'm a documentary filmmaker from Denver.
My name is Hector Galan. I'm an independent filmmaker here in Austin.
My name is Ben De Jesus. I'm a director from New York City.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. My name is Mario Diaz. I'm a director, now currently living in LA, but from Puerto Rico originally.
I'm Ray Diaz from the San Francisco Bay Area.
And I'm Jesus Trevino. I'm from Los Angeles.
I'm Richard Ray Bettis. I'm a senior staffer at the Sundance Institute's documentary film program. I'm also a documentary director.
Hi, I'm Christina Ibarra. I'm a filmmaker originally from El Paso, Texas, and now living in Los Angeles.
My name's Bernardo Ruiz. I'm a documentary filmmaker based in New York, and I just finished a film called Harvest Season.
Hi, I'm Carrie Lozano. I live in Berkeley, California. I'm a filmmaker, journalist, and now film funder.
Hi, I'm Wendy Ginás, and I am at PBS. I work in general audience programming.
Okay, thank you all. Just before we get started, yes. Before we get started, just a couple more thank yous. First of all, thank you to all the filmmakers and executives who came to share your time, and I know very important time away from what you're doing. To the interviewers, which were filmmakers, academics, other documentary filmmakers, journalists who, once again, gave us some of their time to be the interviewers of this distinguished panel. So I just wanted to thank them. Many of them are here in the audience, and we can talk with them later. I also wanted to thank our sponsor, Guillermo Nicolas, and ABC Bank in Zapata. I'm sorry, IBC Bank in Zapata. And also our Dean J. Bernhardt, who gave us his support and some good ideas about how to put all this together. Just to kind of kick things off and kind of give us a framework, you know, I just, for those of us on the panel, you might be thinking about some of the things that you'd want to maybe mention this afternoon. For example, if you have, and you do, a project that you're working on or, you know, finishing and those kinds of things, please let us know what that is so that we can look forward to it and spread the word and all of that. The other thing is, be thinking about just general topics that maybe we can discuss and the audience might be interested in, and these are kind of ideas that came out from yesterday's interview. You know, how you first came to documentary filmmaking, why documentary filmmaking, you know, the big, kind of the big question, particularly in the documentary realm, is, okay, so now you've finished your film, now what? You know, and how do you get it seen? How do you get it distributed? How do you get people to see it? Are there exhibition possibilities? Are there online platforms? All of those kinds of things. Before you're making the film, how do you get it funded, and what kinds of sources can you tap into? What's out there? You know, what do we need to be aware of what's out there? There are programs specifically for Latino filmmakers. How effective are those programs? What are those programs looking for? What are they searching for, just in terms of content or angles on what kinds of stories? You know, and then, you know, for you all who've made films, maybe there are people in the audience who are thinking about making films. And what advice would you give to them? How could they maybe break into making documentaries? You know, any ideas that you have from your experience to their experience. We now have Benicio, who will give us the background of this whole thing. So hold on a second.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Vinicio Cinta. I'm a lecturer at Texas A&M University, San Antonio. So before we begin the roundtable, I would like to give you a thematic overview of some of the literature out there about documentary, and documentary as it pertains to US Latinos. First, looking at documentary film from a media sociology perspective, in the work of Patricia Alderheit in American University, there are 4 key questions or 4 key areas of the research so far. I would like to see how these are reflected in the career trajectory of our interviewees. One of them is, first of all, what gets made. So a very recent article this year came out from Katie Chatou from American University as well, has the number of documentaries directed by people of color at very low proportions still. So peaking at, in 2015 at 15%, using the shortlist from the Academy as the sample in this case. And that's the peaking. So this is kind of an assessment of diversity in production and directing staff in documentary film in what they call the streaming era, or peak TV. So it's supposedly at a time where there's more room or more opportunities in theory to produce new work and to get it out there. And this is for people of color in general. There's not even a breakdown to know how many Latinos, so you can get an idea of how small the proportion probably is. So first is what gets made and what is. And there's a few ethnographic studies, mostly done in Europe. There's evidence from the United Kingdom and from Germany, from observations and interviews with gatekeepers, the people who decide what gets funded and what gets distributed. And as you might imagine, and this applies to journalism, my field, and to other media categories, there's a preference for novelty. So there's always the question of, okay, well, how is this new? And so this penalizes, in a way, pitches that relate to history or to relate or to new angles on things that have been done already. There's also a preference for extremity or extreme versions of cases of issues. And of course, there's a tendency to familiarity, both in terms of who knows who who is part of the network already, but also who's going to be on camera. Is it somebody well-known who's going to narrate? Is this somebody who people can recognize and tune in to hear them? This is evidence from Europe. I don't know how this applies to the US. I would be very interested in seeing how this reflects the situation here. So that's area number one. Area number two is normative and ethical issues. How do documentary filmmakers and producers see themselves? Is this how close the field is to journalism, for example? How close it is to fiction? In many cases, and thinking about the history of Latinos in documentary film, early on, many of the pioneers in the field have done other types of media, have done public affairs television, have been in the news, have gone on to produce or direct fiction. So there's a lot of boundary crossing in terms of the type of work done. So it would be interesting to see, is there a specific expectation or identity for documentary filmmaking, or is it just storytelling? There has been something of a discussion in this regard. The theme number three is the effects of documentaries. Going from historical studies, many of the documentaries, including done by Latinos, have been done to inform, to challenge, receive narratives of what Latinos, how Latinos are, or Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans in specific cases. But there's also the community empowerment issue. The documentaries have been done to recruit people into activism, to kind of build a culture around some sorts of organizing. So there's that side of it as well. There's not as much empirical evidence of the effects, but there's one high-profile case done here in the US showing an experiment, showing a documentary and then applying a survey on political knowledge, show that people do learn new information, and it shapes their view on social issues. So there's potential there. It would be interesting also to see how this relates to how people use news and how people process news, new information from news, especially in this current era of a lot of misinformation, a lot of disinformation campaigns, and just to borrow the phrase that I don't like to use, but fake news, which has become kind of part of the lexicon now. And finally, number four, the role of documentary for democracy. So how it shapes the public sphere, what's its presence in the discussions of current issues, what is the goal of documentary makers in trying to get into these debates. Those are the four themes delineated by Patricia Overheid, Matthew Nisbet, and a lot of the research since then kind of groups in these themes. Now, thinking of the early history of Latino documentary filmmakers, right now, drawing from the work of Rosemary Fregoso, Chon Noriega, and other authors, the start of the history comes along with the Chicano movement. So that's usually the departing point for a lot of these histories, these narratives. Chicano activists who were active in the cultural realm, like Luis Valdez, like Jesus Trevino, were some of the first filmmakers and documentary filmmakers, because many of these first films were documentary or adjacent to documentary filmmaking. The first, going by some scholarly work, the first Chicano film is I Am Joaquin, Yo Soy Joaquin, the adaptation of the poem by Corky Gonzalez. So there's a very close link to activism. There's also this connection, and this applies to journalism as well, to my field, of how in the 1960s, 1970s, the years of the Kerner Report, basically taking a close look at the lack of participation of people of color in media, that kind of prompted some efforts by, I'm sorry. Some movement both by the state and by other institutions to bring more people of color into filmmaking and other media occupations, and that brought more access to that technology and more access to skills training, and that's where many people, including Moctezuma Esparza, Sylvia Morales, they got to start to training programs. Then they went on to become pioneers in the field. Now, the received narrative looks at this start in activism, both for Chicano and Puerto Rican filmmakers, and then a move on to the mainstream, or to a more, to use the term, professionalization. So it's a move from a very political start to going into the mainstream, both by entering the field, Hollywood in some cases, but public television and public media in other cases, but also making other types of media like fiction, like episodic television. So there was this shift. I would like to know, since a lot of the work dates back to the 70s, late 60s, 70s, what has happened since then? And since we have a multi-generational cohort here, I would like to know what has been the experience for the speakers. So this is a general overview. I'll let the presenters talk about their experience. Thank you so much.
Next up, we're going to have Olga Campos-Benz, who's a former journalist and current everything, and she's on the Voces Resource Council. So, Olga.
Thank you, Maggie. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad that you all are here, and to our esteemed guests, with whom you've already become a little familiar with. If you don't already know their work personally, you're in for a treat. As you heard from Charles, we did have a history-making event yesterday, day long. These are folks who they make their livelihood telling and capturing the stories of other people, memorable events. And then yesterday we had our opportunity to turn the lights, the cameras, and the microphones on them to sit down for interviews that lasted approximately 2 hours. It's a long time. 45 questions. We followed the format that has been so successful that Maggie has tweaked for the Voces Oral History Project. And we delved into many topics. Then afterwards, we had a chance to decompress, and certain trends emerged, many of what you're going to hear much more detail about. But I do want to share just a little bit with you from our perspective yesterday. Of course, you've heard that our one-on-one interviews will be archived, and they'll be housed at the Nettie Lee Benson collection, so that will be open and available to everyone. The recorded conversations were about everything in their lives, from their childhoods and where they grew up, their parents, their cultural identities, how that helped to shape them, their viewpoints, their projects that they choose, and the influence of those cultural identities and the issues that they've chosen to spotlight. We delved into their personal careers and their struggles, and they were very open about those struggles and the challenges they face and their successes, and they're so humble in talking about those. Their advice for up-and-coming filmmakers, for students, and the details about their much-anticipated future projects, things that we all have to look forward to as future audiences. So it was, again, a very insightful, full day. Several themes emerged. Of course, many shared with us their groundbreaking, memorable events that launched their careers. I could tell you it was interesting to interview Cristina Ibarra, who said she came here from El Paso to attend UT to be a lawyer until she saw Hector's work, Los Mineros, and that changed her mind completely. And she didn't tell her parents. They know now, right? So it's stories like that that we were able to capture. And I am so very honored to have been part of that conversation. We also talked about their deep commitment to their work, including the efforts by the funders, whose responsibility it is to secure that all-important financing, because without that, just would be a dream. There was a desire to make films that help others, although their beliefs about advocacy and activism differ for each one of them. Each one of them has a separate take on that. There's a shared excitement about exploring new and emerging platforms that you've heard of, that we all know of. We're streaming, we're logging on, we're watching Netflix. So there are new, exciting platforms that will help them to reach younger, broader audiences, international audiences. And so that we encourage them, and we're excited to hear more about that. There is a shared pride about being Latinos, Latinas, Chicanos, whatever they choose to call themselves, and that's certainly a personal choice. But whatever term they do use, our panelists also simply self-identify as competent and independent individuals, and that's how they should be known above all else. Finally, one of the strongest themes that emerged through these conversations is one of praise for Maggie Rivas Rodriguez, for her vision, for the work of the staff and the volunteers whose names you've heard mentioned, for all of the work they did setting up those cameras and checking the lights and doing all of that to help bring this opportunity for you today on Facebook, streaming, and then in those archived interviews to be housed later. It's a lot of work, and we are so grateful for it. These individuals who are here on stage, who make their livelihoods, as I said, capturing other people's experiences and milestones in lives, they were humbled to be asked to share their experiences and talk about their unique adventures in this world of film, documentaries, and entertainment. And so without further ado, I would like to turn the microphone over and know how very special this occasion is to have such esteemed talent and individuals here with us today. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to start off by asking some questions. And I'm going to ask our veterano documentary filmmakers, Hector Galan and Jesus Trevino in particular, to talk about that advocacy part of this. That advocacy, that activism part of documentary filmmaking for you.
Do you want to go first, Jesus?
As senior member on the table here, me toca. I say senior member. I started with a Super 8 camera on a picket line in East Los Angeles in 1968. And in those days, unlike I was saying earlier that this is a documentary encounter, but there's so many documentarians out there documenting us. Well, back in the day, having a camera was a rarity, and I'd often be on a picket line or in some kind of a protest setting, and I'd be the only person with a camera, with a movie camera. And it was Super 8. You know, when you talk about activism, I was on a picket line. And actually, the activism of the incipient Chicano movement in '68, the high school walkouts in East Los Angeles, which were one of the sparks that lit up and that got copied and replicated throughout the Southwest, throughout Aztlan, you know, Crystal City, Texas, Denver, Colorado, places in California, in Arizona. Everyone was walking out once they saw the importance of it and what it meant politically in terms of giving us a voice. As you know, myself and Hector and you know, Ray Tejas here, we represent the baby boom generation, and we came of age in the late 60s. You know, our parents begat us in the 40s, mid-40s to early 50s, but we came of age as a large population of Latinos in the late 60s, and we finally had enough numbers to make a difference. And the difference we made was we said, ya basta. We'd had enough of the discrimination and the inequality that we had suffered for decades. And so it was my generation that said, ya basta, we're going to do something about it, and it's going to fall on us to do it, because if we don't do it, it ain't going to get done. And so activism was a very much a part of that. And to my surprise, when I started, I would do these little film a protest. We did it a 3-minute film. I'd show it in the community hall, and everyone would get activated. And of course, a lot of it was, mira, ahí estoy yo, you know. But it was politicizing them. And the next time we had a rally, there were more people that came out, because they want to be in the movie too. But basically, it taught me that media could be used in a political sense, in an activist sense, to organize people, and that it not only reflected telling them and telling all of us about who we were and what we were doing, but also putting it to use and informing the society at large that we were there and we were there to be contended with. And so, very much so, activism and documentary filmmaking were married from the very, very beginning. They were one and the same. And I think that's continued from then on. And I'll now defer to my esteemed colleague, a brother that I've worked and traveled and been creative with on a number of projects. We both were involved in the 4-part series, Chicano History of the Mexican-American Civil Rights Movement, and of which I'm very proud. And Hector was one of our guiding lights here that put it all together. So Hector?
Thank you, Jesus. You may be a little older, but not by much. As Jesus was saying, Chicano, the interesting thing is that Jesus and I were invited to the White House to show it to the President of the United States. And it was so weird sitting there in that theater, remember? Yeah. So I felt vindicated watching it there, you know, in the White House, especially when I was called a pinko and everything else. At the TV station I was working at, you know, by the anchor people. Of course, they weren't like you, Olga. I mean, you were a lot older. But as we started with the Super 8 in the 60s, I started actually in the early 70s, mid 70s, right after the hippie period. I think I was one of the first Latinos in San Angelo, Texas, in West Texas, where I grew up, that had hair very long. And the interesting thing about long hair and Chicanos is that even though there were tensions between Anglos and Mexican Americans, when you had long hair, you related. So there'd be one guy, Anglo, walking by, you'd be walking by, you say, peace, brother. And it was like equality. Well, when that started to end, and I went to Lubbock to go to Texas Tech, go Raiders, you know, but there was a demarcation line between San Angelo and Lubbock, 200 miles away from each other. I knew that there were what my parents went through, especially my dad. I'm seventh generation Tejano, and where he grew up in Cristobal, Texas, with segregated Mexican schools and all of that. I knew that history. I wasn't quite as angry yet as I got, as I started to become indoctrinated into the winds of change that were coming from California, Crystal City, the Raza Unida Party, and I got very, very involved. Early on, I was one of the first long hairs to be hired at the one TV station in San Angelo, because the guy had long hair too, who hired me. He was from Louisiana, but I had some TV experience, and so I started, you know, working in commercial TV, running camera and directing news and things like that. It wasn't an easy start, but then the ENG period came in, the EFP period, which is they call it the electronic news gathering, the mini cams, the video, you know, that you could take out in the field. And I truly believed when I started working at PBS at Texas Tech that I could change the world with video. And I was covering everything. Back then in the 70s, there was a lot of police brutality going on here in Texas. They were killing Mexican Americans left and right, just like what's going on right now across the nation with African Americans. It was here in Texas. We'd be out protesting, we'd be out filming, and I was covering everything. So really it was that fervor that you get as a student, as a young person out there, and what a camera can do. And I really, really believed it. And I took those lessons much later into my career, doing stories that hadn't been told, just to show people another side. But that had a very, very important impact on me.
You know, what you said about once you had that minicam and you could leave the television studio and you could go out in the field, it gave you this feeling that you thought you could change the world. And I think those of us who did some of the interviews heard that from many of you. So I'm wondering how many of you are making documentaries in that vein? In other words, you're making them because you think this type of film can help change the world. Anybody that wants to jump in?
Well, I would say I'll take it from a little bit of a meta level. So in my job at Sundance Institute, I oversee a fund that's specifically to create social impact stories. So yes, when I'm a filmmaker, I aspire to do it, but also as a funder, I fund specifically around social impact, both documentary, scripted, et cetera. And there's a lot of that we're learning about the power of a story and how a story lives in society that makes me better understand. And so I'm sure Carrie knows this too, that stories have the capacity to do a variety of changes. Some stories are can build movements, reinforce movements. Some stories can target a specific policy change. Some stories are very subtle and are part of a cumulative process to create a culture shift. Some stories are very indirect. And I think storytellers are getting much more sophisticated around how to use story for a desired social impact. And sometimes the best way to use story is the non-obvious way. I do a lot of research and reading in the field, and there was a fascinating interview I heard with a film critic at the Washington Post. And she was talking about shifting the narrative around LGBT people and the perception in the field. So there was this popular film, it's like I Now Pronounce You Chuck, and it's like a Larry and Chuck, right? Two straight white guys, they're firemen. One of them loses his wife and he's gonna lose benefits. So they fake their marriage, that they're two gay men getting married. And that's the story that they have to put on the charade. That writer thinks actually that may have done more for marriage equality than Brokeback Mountain. And this is why. Because what that story showed is an intimacy developed between these two straight dudes. That was a relationship that audience, straight men who go see those guys, typically don't see. And so that was a very interesting, subtle cultural shift for that target audience that probably had more of an impact than Brokeback Mountain. As filmmakers, sometimes we are some kind of just straight on, like a hammer toward a nail, and we're not thinking about varieties of telling a story and how to really shift an issue. And I think that's something we can learn for the activist impulse in it.
And that storytelling component that you talked about so wonderfully was a big part, I think, of yesterday's interviews as well. So many of you, in one way or another, said, "I'm a storyteller." And since I was part of Christina's interview, and since we're both from El Paso, I remember, Christina, that you said, I'm a storyteller, and everything flows from that. You told us, I have a story to tell. So maybe you can develop that idea a little bit. And the rest of you jump in as well. Christina.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Definitely, I did come to film because I wanted to make an argument about the world. I was really interested in saying, this is how I think. Hear from me. Just feeling a little bit invisible. And once I got that, I was hooked into that feeling, then I was able to kind of look at the craft of filmmaking. So my interest in film started from this like social issue kind of drive, but then I started to kind of respect the craft a little bit more and understand that there were different ways of telling the story. And I guess one thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately is, we all have these windy paths that sometimes are a little bit illicit, but so these windy paths to get to where we are, and it's so great to see all of my colleagues here and learn about like the choices that they're making and how they're telling their stories and where they came from. But I guess one thing I'm thinking about right now is how does that the funding, the search for funding determine the grammar of your story. And it feels as if the generation before us broke open these doors to be able to get us into PBS and the public broadcasting system and some commercial networks, and that's great. And so now, for me, the challenge is, you know, how do I gain legitimacy in trying to maybe make different choices? You know, maybe not. Do I want to take that path of like getting filtering my film through the lens that these dominant channels use, or do I want to push against it? And so that's my challenge that I'm thinking about these days is, you know, how do I present a new way of telling a story that's mine, that's organic to what I'm trying to say, but maybe isn't what people are used to, you know?
You know, so we've hit against you know, the big problem of any filmmaking, but documentary filmmaking for sure, is funding. And some of you are involved in, you know, in helping those funds get distributed, and some of you are knocking on the door and looking for that funding. So if any of you would like to talk about funding and storytelling and how that happens, and yes, jump in.
Yes, so I mean, I'm a filmmaker by background, and probably one of the scrappiest among us here, you know, it's like clawing my way to make my work, which actually is pushing form, often very artistic, doesn't necessarily have a social issue or an obvious one all the time, which are harder films to fund. And the reason that there are a number of reasons why I turned the corner and became somebody who works at a big organization, the International Documentary Association, and I run a fund there that supports films that intersect with journalism, documentary films that intersect with journalism, but in all kind of artistic forms. And we're supported by the MacArthur Foundation. And so why did I step into that role? Part of it is something we were talking about last night, is really looking at who the gatekeepers are and who the decision makers are, all of whom I think in our field are really well-meaning and smart people. But if they're looking at everything from one perspective, which is mostly a Caucasian lens, there's a lot that you're going to miss in terms of storytellers, in terms of storytelling, in terms of the subject matter. You know, what is the perspective of the film? What is the perspective of the filmmaker? And are you just reiterating a lot of stereotypes and narratives about our community, about other people of color, about the Native American community? And so part of my goal and what I'm interested in doing is opening the doors for broader representation so that Christina can make any film she wants to make about any subject, not just because she's a person of color, because she's an incredible filmmaker, but making sure that we are understanding the representation. So funding is challenging. I think funders are becoming more interested in having these discussions, but it's fairly new, I would say, and Richard can attest to this too. I mean, we do have these discussions behind closed doors, but it is not my sense that it's been happening for a long time. What it takes is people like us to be at the table to say, wait a minute, have you thought about this? You know, look at the narrative that this film is perpetuating. You know, is this the filmmaker that we want to support? What about this filmmaker? And so I think it just takes more and more people with power, you know, at the table who come from a different life experience and a different perspective.
I want to add something.
We have one here.
Sure,
Hey,
and I want to venture to say, because we have similar perspectives, that we come from very high-powered funding organizations, and we see patterns. And I want to just call out that, I don't know if I'm being overly dramatic, but there is a very serious, what I would call a narrative inequality emerging amongst our people, right? Like income inequality, that our stories are not being told in proportion, and they're not being funded, and they will not be funded unless we do something about it. I really have to put an emphasis on it. I would go to say that we might be nearing a crisis.
Why?
Because there are so few resources for documentary filmmaking, and they're being primarily focused on what I would call on the 1%, the most talented filmmakers. And those are filmmakers who have had access to the best mentorship, who've been practicing their craft for decades, and us, the tools are relatively new, right? And so we're not yet as competitive en masse. Individually we are, some of us are, articulating our stories on paper, presenting sample reels, interrogating our stories. Sometimes the stories we're telling, the funders are saying, I've heard this before, because our communities have been mined for those stories. The white people have been telling immigration stories for decades. We want to tell them our way. They're like, I know that one already. You know, I think the academic earlier was talking about novelty, right? Well, our stories have been mined, so they're not novel anymore. So we're at a really competitive disadvantage when we're coming to these traditional funding sources that are funding the 1%. And they're also not investing in artist development. So for example, I oversee an artist development fund, but it focuses on filmmakers from Africa and India, because that's where the funder wants. That's what's paying our bills. And it's sad that I get to go to Africa. I created a lab in China to develop and help them improve those stories. There's nobody doing that level of intense artist development here in this country for Latino filmmakers.
I guess I would offer more of like a silver lining to the situation that you guys spoke about, which is true and is definitely a factor. Currently, I'm doing 2 documentary films. One is a great performances on John Leguizamo's show, Latin History for Morons. That's coming out next Friday. And then the other film I'm doing is an American Masters on Raul Julia. And typically, those are 2 strands that are signature programs from PBS that don't really have Latino-centric subjects. It's just, I think there's only been 2 Latinos on American Masters. It's been around for 30 years. So what I found for my own technique to get my films made is that I've aligned myself really tightly with Sandy Pedlo and the great team at Latino Public Broadcasting, and what we've strategized in developing my career, because I feel like they've helped me, they've nurtured me for many years already, and I've done my best to deliver, is what I do and what I've done in these past 2 cases is I will come up with an idea, and rather than bring it directly to PBS or to go to American Masters, I would bring it to Sandy and the great people at Latino Public Broadcasting. Now, the reason I do that is because their mandate is any film they fund has to get onto PBS. So I already have that. It's like a backdoor channel for me. So by me getting Sandy and Latino Public Broadcasting to give me a smaller grant, all of a sudden it's on the radar of the PBS people. So what I found is once you get someone like LPB in your corner, all of a sudden the momentum is building, and before I knew it, we were able to strategize and figure out how do we fill in the rest of the funding gap, which was substantial. But I would just offer that to the filmmakers and the audience and even the people on the panel, is that there are other ways to figure out your way in, and I found that to be really fruitful, and it's thanks to people like Rick and the rest of the funders, like Harry and Sandy in particular, that because they have this position of power, there's a way to leverage it, and all of a sudden, before you know it, you have 2 films, you know, on 2 major strands at PBS, highlighting Latinos that deserve to be highlighted, which is what I feel is my calling to do. So,
thank
If
you
I could
very
just
much.
say something. So there are various ways to get your program on PBS, and one of the ways is actually, like you mentioned, Latino Public Broadcasting. There's also direct to PBS, where we commission certain projects, and those are usually tied to a bigger initiative that we have coming up, whether it's space or whether it's the anniversary of the women's suffrage and the women's right to vote. Any of those themes, and right now we're actually looking for stories that will deal with election issues for 2020. Also, we have obviously Independent Lens, we have POV, and then the other thing that a lot of people don't know is that there are many member stations, PBS member stations, that will bring programs to us that they think will resonate with a national audience as well. So sometimes we get films in that way too. So there are various ways, and like you mentioned, American Masters, American Experience. Someone like me, when I usually look at something, I try to figure out where it would fit in best in any of those different strands. And that's usually how I go about it when I see something. The other thing that I want to mention is that it is incredibly frustrating to see that we're still having the same conversations that we were having 10, 20 years ago. At the same time, there is a push internally, and it helps to get the push externally as well. Thank you, Maggie. Because if you get the push externally, then it's easier for us to make that argument inside as well, and saying that not only do we want a particular slot for Latino films and Latino filmmakers, which is all great and good, but my ideal is that we wouldn't need a specific slot where you only want to see these programs during Latino Heritage Month. You would see it integrated throughout all of the programming that we offer, whether that's a Nova or whether that's American Masters or any of the other strands. It shouldn't just be on that 1 o'clock, 10 p.m. slot on Monday nights where we have indie films, but throughout the week. That would be the goal from my perspective.
I remember did you want to say something? I had spoken to Ray Theus previously before, months ago, and I was asking him about how do you get your, so you produce a film. It's a great documentary, but then how do you become noticed? How do people know that it exists, and how do you get people to enter film festivals, or how does that work? And I'd like for you to address that, if you could, Ray. But also, the other part that you told me that really stuck with me, because I come from a journalism background and I teach journalism here, is the role of journalism in creating, basically creating some knowledge and awareness about your work.
Okay, well, I came out of literature and out of journalism, and basically, I spent 10 years at a KQED, PBS station. And the films that the stories we did were based in journalism. I mean, went by the rules. So I held on to that and basically used that kind of as a guiding principle in the work that I've done over the years. And my work has been varied. I did a film recently for American Masters called Pedro y Guerrero, A Photographer's Journey. And that was a portrait of a man that very few people knew about. He was a photographer for Frank Lloyd Wright, and people knew his work. They never knew the man. For Alexander Calder, Louise Nevelson said. So when these telling our stories, which is kind of like what we're all doing, we're telling our stories, and what I mean by our stories is everybody's stories, the stories of all of us. And so I also did a film called The Storm That Swept Mexico, on the Mexican, 2-hour film, The Mexican Revolution. But in order to even consider getting that on PBS and getting that funded, is that we had to do very rigorous work. This was a film where very early on LPB put money into it, but the National Endowment for the Humanities funded us. And basically we worked with them step by step, a $10,000 grant, a planning grant, then a $20,000 grant, a scripting grant, and finally we got a $700,000 production grant. But we only got that money because we were very, very rigorous every step of the way. We had to do good history. The people who we consulted with had to be the top folks in the world. And the thing about it is that the NEH, they were great allies. They knew it. They knew we were getting the best folks. And so that's where the journalism came in. We never would have gotten that film done if it hadn't been for that kind of rigor.
You were also talking about having it reviewed by journalists.
Well, the thing is that film before it had to be vetted. It had to be vetted by historians and journalists, because they weren't about to let this film. I mean, it was a problematic film, because that film was made to correct U.S. history, in my opinion. Okay, it had to be done because really the film was about the relationship between Mexico and the United States. And Tom Phelps, who was a program officer at the NEH at that time, understood that, and that's why he was supportive of it. But most people just don't get it. So it was one of these things where I also was in a peculiar situation because we were able to raise a big chunk of money. We spent $1.5 million almost on that film, and there were folks at WETA and WGBH and WNET who were really pissed off that this little production company on the West Coast got this money, and we were in a partnership. I'm all about. I hope you don't mind a little chisme here, but anyway, we were in a partnership, and Hector can relate to this very well with the station here in Texas, who will go unnamed. who basically were our partners but betrayed us. And we were locked in. We had $700,000 ready to go, but we were locked in because they wanted Final Cut, and I said no. I want Final Cut because I'm the person who's responsible for here. I'm responsible for telling good history in a whole community. And I came to the point to blows with them. We basically said, I'll kill this project. I'll bring it down if it comes down to that, because I'm not about to hand that over to you folks who really don't know what you're talking about. And the other thing is, I felt very strongly it had to be a Chicano, myself in this case, telling the story. The white folks have a version of history and they're going to push it in one direction. The Mexicanos have going another direction. And being a very, I'm a Chicano, Mexicano, I know my people. And on both sides, the gringos and the Mexicanos, and I know that there's vested interest there. So I knew that I just wanted to tell the truth, a strong story, a historically accurate story. And I went through, in terms of funding this film and getting it done, I went through 10 years making this film. 8 years of it was hell, and 2 years were great, and actual production. But the thing is, it's that commitment to telling, to good storytelling, to telling history, and I think the foundation for that is understanding how to go about it, how to do your research as a journalist, how to report, how to interview, how to write, and the weak part was, for me, was the raising of the money. That was a novel experience, as I'm sure a lot of you understand. We got support at the end from PBS because they realized the value of this film, but at the beginning, they weren't putting any money into it. So I hope that answers your question.
I don't know. I'm just sitting here. I feel like such an outlier in a way, because.
But don't feel that way.
No,
don't feel
no.
that way.
I'll address it actually.
Yeah, no.
I have some thoughts about it.
Yeah. Let's hear them.
Because I've never taken money from PBS in my life. I've never, done a film in the public broadcasting system, and at first, it's funny because at first I thought, well, this is great. I consider myself a director for hire, and sometimes, I get to go to a network and say I want to make this film or this project, and they greenlight it and they give me a budget, and that's it. That's all the fundraising I have to do. It's essentially just like, convince somebody to just, to trust me to put something on network television, but it comes with certain strings, right? And for me, just as an example, I just finished a pilot for the Paramount Network. This is public, so I guess I'll see this. And the pilot was a true crime story, and the story was easily a 90-minute film, but we had to fit it into a 42-minute format, and that was really trying and frustrating. To say nothing of notes that you get from network executives, who often, they're very special. They have very special requests that you have to put up with, and so I don't know. I just don't want to bore people because I've been talking about this all weekend with people here. I kind of envy the, I look at the other side of it, somebody who can nurture and sit with a film for a number of years and develop it and really, put all their heart and soul into it and have the time to give it to other people, to show it to other people and really workshop it. That's something that I don't do in my work generally. I did a series called Death Row Chronicles about Death Row Records in LA, the famous record label, Suge Knight, Dr. Dre, whatever, about which I knew nothing. I didn't. I'm a Puerto Rican guy. I lived in New York. I had no real concept of the gangster rap era in LA. And I had 8 months to do a 6-part series of 1 hour episodes. And we had 6 rooms going at the same time while I was still shooting. It was it's crazy sometimes. I mean, I'm quite happy about how that turned out, and it's rewarding in some ways. But you know, I like documentary. I like documentary as an audience member. I seek out documentaries. You know, I like experimenting. I'm an editor by trade, so you know, sometimes it's just important to take the time and to be creative about it. You know, the other part of it is that, and I guess I somewhat addressed it, is that there's compromises to be had. And yeah, I did a movie for ESPN for 30 series called Brothers in Exile, which is really my film. I feel like they gave me all the freedom to do it, and I'm really proud of it. But you know, that's a unique experience. And so, you know, the filmmaker in me wants to maybe try having to, you know, claw and beg and, you know, for some money. Go ahead.
Let me just follow up. In that, you know, a lot of us jump back and forth from independent filmmaking, and you know, sometimes I after get beat up, then I love going and making films with somebody else's money. It's fun. I mean, it's really, really fun. You get to do a Nat Geo or do something like that. It's like, okay, I don't have to raise any money. I just have to tell the story. And this is where the joy, sometimes you need to do that to bring back the joy of storytelling and just have fun making a film. Now, the other thing is, it's not necessarily your film. It's their show. You have to make some compromises, but that's good too. So I think, for me, it's been great to be able to jump back and forth because it keeps me juiced. It keeps me going. I have some fun with it.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to talk about, related to just what you just said, is voice. You know, when you look at it, you can either be a gun for hire, in which case, you know, more than half of my career has been as an episodic television director. And the rules are very clear. I come on the set, I've been hired to direct an episode of, you know, Criminal Minds or Law and Order or you know, whatever, and I play by the rules. I know it's not a Chicano story or a Latino story, necessarily. I know that if Latinos are in it, they're probably in you know, Law and Order, they're probably Boricuas, and they're probably the bad guys, you know. But you know, you play by those rules. You have to, because that's what that genre is about, and that's what you're doing, and you realize that what you're doing for is a paycheck. Then I ask myself, but what about my Latino voice? How do I express that? And that's a tougher question, because it's very rare that you can use the established media forms, like what you were saying, you know, a series where you're actually in control, and they're funding it, and it's about our voice. It's your voice. It's our community. That's a rarity. And so most of us, I think, have to make that choice. And my resolution has been that when I'm in play with the devil, I play by the devil's rules. And then when I can, I create my own rules, and I make my own documentaries, most of them self-financed, that are about my people, and they're my voice. And that's another way to go. And at least that's a purity of what I have to say about what I'm doing. My current venture for the past 4 or 5 years has been my website, Latinopia. And over the past 4 or 5 years, I've made 500 5-minute videos about our community. You know, art, literature, music, theater, cinema, food. Our writers, our poets, our musicians. You know, I'm trying to make it the who's who of who we are as Latinos in America, principally in continental United States, Chicanos, Cuban Americans, and Boricuas, and Puerto Rico's included, brothers. I have a couple of bloggers from Puerto Rico. But the point being that we have to have our own voice and our own mechanisms for doing that. Having said that, I look back on some of the things we've been talking about here with the LPB, with the work that you've been doing on PBS. We have these avenues, you know, what you've been doing with Sundance. We have these avenues which are certainly to be taken advantage of. But I also ask myself, are we working at maximum speed? Are we working at optimal productivity. And I would venture to say that we're not. That as a community, we are undermined, underworked. We don't have enough of us that are out there doing it. And those that do products, those products are often ignored or shuffled, or you find them on the internet on a website that no one visits. And my question to all of us is, how do we change that? How do we get more of us out there? And what are the obstacles and what are the areas we have to address to really be authentic about our own voice? A Latino voice that speaks about our concerns. And yes, you know, you can get hired and be a gun for hire, but you're basically doing the man's work, and basically what you're doing is telling their stories. And that's happened for way too long, and it's time for us to, you know, we now have platforms where we can tell our own story. How do we make that story better?
Well, I just want to say it briefly that for me, I mean, I still get a lot of joy out of being a director for hire, and it's important to control the things you can control, right? So I'm not going to take a film or a series about something that doesn't speak to me. And I try to be very deliberate about the choices I make. You know, I'm not going to, I have no clue what, you know, hedge fund managers do on Wall Street, you know. And if you look at my reel, there's, you know, it's very deliberate. There's black and brown faces on, you know, on my films, on my shows, all over the place. So in that regard, you know, I think that, you know, I don't feel so like my voice has been shut down. I just think that creatively there are certain compromises that are, you know, that just because it's the nature of the business, you know, it's like they want it fast, they want it in the way that they want it sometimes, and that's the compromise you make. But you know, I started in news. I worked for Televisa and for the Associated Press for 10 years. I also see my job, even when I work as a gun for hire, you know, as I was talking to somebody who interviewed me very briefly before the panel, and I mean, just to put it simply, you know, the long form equivalent, you know, the written long form equivalent, visual long form equivalent of an article. So, you know, there's more meat and context in what we do, and I think that's important, even if it is of a certain commercial, you know, ilk. You know, I think she posed a question like, what would you tell the you know, people who are interested, students who are interested in documentary right now? What is their place? And I feel like with the world we live in right now, you know, media can be you know, very binary. It could be very simplistic. And I think we have an opportunity as documentary filmmakers to provide all those things, you know, that this fast sort of consumption of media doesn't provide. You know, we sit down, we watch, we get to the heart of a subject or a person or an issue and really examine it from different angles. And I think that, you know, I really respect the work that we all do here, and I feel like that is a role that we're fulfilling, you know.
So I'm glad my new friend Mario said that he was identified himself as the outlier. So I'm going to stretch that a little bit further to the Rocky Mountain, the Rocky Mountain region, the one time zone that is not represented by except me. So being in Denver, just being between the two coasts, it's you know, there's this in Colorado and where my family is from in New Mexico, have this a very long history of a Latino presence in the United States that is often overlooked. And so to try and kind of cut through all the noise has been my challenge. It's a challenge that I definitely embrace. A previous short doc that I made was about a former MS-13 member who was originally from Los Angeles, but the fact that he had relocated to Denver actually made the story, I think, more unique. And he had left his gang days behind him a long time ago, and that made him more accessible as a character to anybody. You didn't have to be from LA to understand his story. And now I'm working on a film about a lady who was really at the forefront of the sanctuary movement for immigrants, and she lives and operates out of Denver. She flies around all the time, and she's not only advocating for undocumented immigrants like herself, but she also is facing deportation at the same time. So I have the access to these great characters, and sometimes cutting through the noise can be frustrating, but at the same time, it's also very liberating because it's the access that I kind of create myself, and you just cobble away as little as you possibly can, and eventually all the little bits and pieces that you've mined turn out to be a good story, hopefully. I'll take the outlier.
I want to talk a little bit about funding. I've done both. I'm sorry for I've got a serious allergies, as you all know, people who live here in Austin. But, for years I worked as a gun for hire. I did a lot of, I used to work for Frontline out of Boston quite a bit. One year, I think this was in around '94, I raised some money to do an independent film called Songs of the Homeland about the history of Tejano music. And it aired on PBS. I was able to get it on. And then all of a sudden, we started getting calls. People wanted to buy it. I said, what? Yeah, people are calling. The stations are giving them our number. How much you want to sell it for? I said, I don't know. Tell them $29. And add $5 for shipping and handling. And all of a sudden, hundreds and thousands of letters and phone calls. And we sold so many VHS tapes. I got the bug. And I said, dang. From that point on, I realized I needed to be an owner of all my shows. So I stopped working, not 100%, but mostly gun for hire, and started just owning all my programs. And so that's another way. And today, I'm still selling programs that I did 20 years ago because they're part of history or they're evergreens. They never get old. But there's a market out there. And I learned. And it was a great feeling selling all those tapes. And then not only that, a lot of times people were buying it with same little notes. Oh, what a great program. And we were getting letters from all over the country. Oh, and my God, there's a lot of Tejanos everywhere. And they were all part of the migrant stream, I think. But I just thought I'd tell that story. And really the key to this is ownership. And that's very important.
Sure. I guess I wanted to go back to Jesus's question about what can be done. I can be loud. How's that? Yeah, I wanted to go back to Jesus's point. I mean, in my case, I'm a documentarian. I've made 3 feature documentaries, and also do some for-hire work. But I think there is a bigger challenge, which is, on the one hand, it's a kind of boom time for documentary and nonfiction. There's a greater market, greater audience familiarity with documentaries, but it's also a particular type of environment. And I think that many things that are labeled as documentaries are in fact factual entertainment. It's just an extension of what has been happening in cable for years. And so I think there's a very important distinction to be made between the kind of film that Cristina and her partner are making, that, films that have a very specific voice, versus the type of thing that's, a celebrity biography or, a travel and food show. So in my case, the most recent thing I did is a film called Harvest Season, which is about the immigrant and Mexican Latino presence in Napa and Sonoma and wine country. And part of why I wanted to make that film is because if you look at the bulk of food and wine programming, very little of it deals with the back of the room. And I'm not talking about doing an investigative expose about labor conditions. I'm just talking about celebrating the reality of who puts food and wine on our tables. And so I think, on the one hand, there's this greater interest in nonfiction storytelling. On the other hand, there are very strong commercial imperatives, which is why the nonprofit funders are so important. I mean, there are problems and challenges there. And I would say I don't share Ben's optimistic take on LPB. I mean, LPB, Latino Public Broadcasting, funded my current documentary, but they're in a very weakened state right now and need much more support. And there needs to be, they need greater funding from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And that's why I think what Maggie, what you've done has been so critical. That outside advocacy, that kind of pressure is what pushes public entities and foundations to move. Without that pressure, the money isn't there, and we don't get to work, and we don't get to tell these stories. So it is absolutely vital that continue to happen. In the past, it's happened from multiple organizations. Nalip used to do this. I think they have not done as much advocacy as I would like to see lately. So I think we need to be in a kind of, we're all part of an ecosystem, but at the end of the day, if we want to get a diverse array of stories that help expand the idea of what, of who and what is an American, et cetera, if we want to do that, we really need both pressure from the outside as well as the work. We don't work in a vacuum. We can't push everything uphill by ourselves. So what we really need is that external support, I think, Maggie, that you've been doing, and by having this convening, which I think is so critical.
I also want to just follow up to say, to Hector's point, I mean, it's an exciting time because there's a lot of opportunity and there's a lot of demand, but the reality is that these new opportunities have disrupted what was a tried and true model for us. So I too believe in owning my work, and we made money owning our work, splitting up those rights, capitalizing on foreign sales, capitalizing on the educational market, and that's being cannibalized now by large entities that have a very wide reach, but who want all of our rights and who want to own our films in perpetuity. And I think that, like, as much as that's exciting and can really work for a lot of films, it really does create a crisis for indies who, all of whom want to own our work, want to be able to make decisions about the trajectory of the work, want to be able to have outreach and impact screenings, and who want to get checks on the back end, as we still do for Weather Underground, 15, 16 years later. We own that film, and it still makes not a lot of money, but a little bit of money, and that's because we controlled its destiny and still control it.
So this is to basically all of you. Great, we're live streaming this, we have this event, but beyond that, what can the rest of us do to try to provide that support, the external pressure that Bernardo talks about?
So I agree, PBS needs help. I think we can do some more self-empowerment and stop holding out our hand for public assistance. I think we can organize our business leaders and successful community leaders and pool our resources. There are models that other organizations and other communities are doing, right, where they're pulling together their members of their high net worth members of their community to fund documentaries that are important to them. Because reality is PBS could only fund a very small percentage of our stories at a very small percent. So we represent the 1%, right? We'll be fine. These guys will make movies, right? All that other 99% probably won't happen, or they may not be done very well, right? So how do we come up with our own systems and stop holding out our hand and get out of the welfare line? And stop asking for corporate, crumbs off the table. We have millionaires in these communities. We have philanthropists now, right? Why aren't they supporting the telling of our stories and the amplification of those stories?
I'd also like to add, because we were talking about this earlier, that one of the things that I've been talking to people about is that if you are a gun for hire on any of your shows, you should ask that you include an apprentice as part of your budget who can learn the craft along with you, and that is the only way that we're going to make the needle move in any significant way, if we're actually training folks to do all of the things that are happening on a set on a consistent basis. And many people are always afraid to say, I want extra, because no one wants to explode that budget. But I think when you get to a certain point in your career, there are certain things that you can ask for, and people will not even bat an eye. And you have nothing to lose by asking.
Otherwise, you're perpetuating a system of inequality and lack of access.
Yeah, I agree completely, and I feel like I want to just take a moment because just being on this stage, it struck me that, you know, we have our OGs. Is it on? Yeah. Okay. We have, I just want to give a special shout out to Hector Galan and to Jesus Trevino for kind of blazing the path before we came, because in a lot of ways, they've made it possible for us to be taking seriously as legitimate filmmakers. And also shout out to my boy Mario, who gave me my first documentary I produced with him 13 years ago when I was underqualified, but very enthusiastic.
As part of that job training we were just talking about.
That's what I'm saying. I'm a product of that, and we were talking about it yesterday. We just grabbed the camera. We didn't know enough to like know that we couldn't do it, so we just did it.
We had a little PD-150 and a little Total Light with an umbrella.
Yep.
That we carried around.
And 2 boxes of tapes, and then we had to buy more boxes later. But we shot literally 90% of the documentary in like 13 days, and then we sold it to HBO Latino. But that was just one of my first little breaks that happened, and it's this idea of paying it forward. And then also, like, in terms of having the luxury that Jesus has, where he does commercial and then he does his own things, that's the path that I'm going for, because that's what I want to do. I've just started my episodic career and started directing sitcoms for Disney. But what I found is that it will give me some breathing room. I'll make a good living, and at the same time, I will never stop telling the stories that I want to tell, because I will have that foundation. So, and then one other shout out, Ray, because Ray's documentary Guerrero was so successful on American Masters, it literally paved the way for me to go in with Raul Julia. So I want to thank you. So it's just like, I'm just having a moment where I'm really feeling gratitude, because this is what happens. And 10 years from now, maybe somebody who's in the audience now, or somebody who's at Nalip that listens to us on a panel will feel the same way. So it's not about quantity, it's about quality. And with a small group of people, you can really impact a lot of change. And so I just want to, like, I am an optimist, Bernardo, you're right. But it's how I feel. I feel like this is the best time ever onto the future. So I feel like this is great, but we just got to keep bringing people up along the way. Like the 2 docs that I'm doing now, I would say 80% of the crew, staff, PAs, everybody is Latino or of color. Well, actually, if it's of color, it's 90%. So I mean, there's ways to do it and affect change in your own circle immediately.
I got to underscore that. I got to tell you an interesting story. When we had gotten the green light to do Resurrection Boulevard, there were only 2 of us who were Latino, Dennis Leone, the executive producer, writer, and myself as the director. And so I had brought a stack of resumes, 1 stack for writers, 1 stack for cinematographers, 1 stack for sound people, 1 stack for wardrobe. I mean, I prepared. So I go in there, and of course, there's all the Paramount people, Showtime people, and production guy says, well, you got to understand, this is your first time out. We want this series to be successful. And so we think that it shouldn't be about, Spanish surname. It should be the very, very, very best we can find in the field. And so they're ready to throw out these lists that I have compiled, right? And I look over at Dennis, and he looks over at me, and I said, well, if that's the philosophy, then, I'm sure there are better writers in the Writers Guild than Dennis Leone. I'm sure you could probably find one of them, and I'm sure they won't be Latino. And I'm sure there are directors out there better than me. So I think what you ought to do is find them and replace me and Dennis, and then you could do the first American broadcast Latino show about Latinos without any Latinos in it. And that shut them up. And they said, let's see the list. And that first season, you should see the surnames. You can Google it. We got all our people in there.
Fernando, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously, I appreciate the enthusiasm, and in order to do the type of work that we have to do, it's important to remain stubbornly optimistic. I just think it's important also to simultaneously have a critical conversation about the realities of the business. I'm not a fiction person. I'm not interested in directing episodic television. I'm a documentary filmmaker. But the landscape has really changed, and I think more and more, I do think people like me will not be working at public television. I'm making films for the streaming platforms now, just because that's where the budgets are, and I think there's a lost opportunity there for public television. And while I share Rick's idea that we need to move away from strictly the public model, I do believe that as long as there is a public model, it's important that it be well-funded, robust, and that it be doing what it says it does. Public television raises money on the idea of diversity and doesn't always act in those ways. And so I think as long as that's there, I think it's really important that it be protected, that it be developed, that there's new leadership, like folks like Wendy and Pam Aguilar, which represent a huge step forward from my perspective. So I think it's very important to look at it holistically. I'm thrilled by the success of my colleagues. Every time one of them, I'll be the first person to watch the Raul Julia documentary. That's very exciting to me. I think more and more I'm thinking about the field as a whole, what we can be doing to strengthen filmmakers across the board, and also move away from the kind of burden that many of us, the burden of telling social justice stories that's placed on us. Nobody's telling Morgan Neville, the director of the Mr. Rogers film, that he has to tell a social history. He gets to make any kind of film he wants. So I think we need to have enough success, enough support for filmmakers to be able to tell absolutely any story that they'd like to tell.
I just want to clarify, I'm not saying move away from the public model. I think this could, there are other models that keep it pursued alongside, that we can't become over-reliant on one source of funding and one source of distribution.
I don't think anybody will ever reject, like a $50,000 check from a private donor. I mean, I agree. But cultivating that is the challenge.
Totally agree. Yeah, I think I've had experience with public television too. My feature film, Caesar's Last Fast, was funded by it. It premiered at Sundance in competition.
I think it's worth telling everybody that story, because that's, yeah.
And we're streaming, so I'm gonna be as diplomatic as possible. But I would have to say that film, like I said, it screened in competition at Sundance, had the most disappointing support from public television, that ultimately I just gave them their money back, because there was a commercial broadcaster and distributor who was offering 3 times as much, and PBS wouldn't offer a penny more. And so, nor were they, it was just, and it was sad because it was a feature documentary about Cesar Chavez's spiritual commitment to his work that deserved to be seen by a public television audience. But they, in the 7 years I was making that film, provided minimal support, letters of support, but no money. And I think that reflects, some people are very connected to the PBS system, and but I think outside of that small percentage of people, I learned that we can't rely on them to tell all of our stories. Yes, they're important. I'm not arguing against public television, right? But, in a sense, it's still like a reliance on public assistance. And do all of us need to be relying
I disagree with that framing, because I think public assistance, it's putting a pejorative
it's
deliberately
pejorative.
But it's actually
deliberately pejorative.
No,
and this
but
is
it's
why.
our money. It's our money. Those are our tax dollars. Yeah. And so it's not a handout.
So I mean, yeah. Well, they treat it like it. And wait, let me tell you. No, I'm using the pejorative deliberately, right? They're condescending. the contracts for the rights they want, for the amount of contact that they did. This is, it remind me of the nightmare scenario when my dad would go to the bank in Mexico and those bureaucrats will say, you didn't fill out your withdrawal forms correctly, go fill them out again, get in the back of the line. Now, some people, it works for them very well, and they're very connected.
Yeah.
I would say for the majority of applicants, right?
Yeah.
And if you probably do a survey of the people who apply and their experience, right? I would say it's probably not that thrilling.
I think, I mean, many of us have been rejected multiple times. I think that framing is problematic, though, especially when you consider, I mean, a lot of the Sundance funds are, it's wealthy philanthropists who have very specific
Totally.
agendas. So
I readily admit, I come from a place of privilege.
I'm just saying,
You
it's
know?
all funding sources to some extent, it's not just the commercial world. All funding sources, money has a personality. So what doesn't matter whether it's coming from a network, a foundation, a specific fund that asks you to, twist yourself like a pretzel to do something. Part of our jobs as filmmakers is to be creative with those resources and have a broad reach. One of the very few reasons, and your experience is one of the few reasons why I still stay with public television is there is an opportunity to reach a broad audience for free. We get, viewers don't need to have a subscription, they don't have a license. Like, there's an opportunity to do something there. However, I do think it's becoming an increasingly less relevant model, and I think that's unfortunate.
There's one thing that just thinking in terms of calls to action, in terms of what everybody in this room can do is sometimes, and I'm totally speaking for myself, but sometimes I think we also suffer from an audience problem. The films that all these folks are making and have been making don't necessarily find the audience that they deserve. And just by telling your friends, by telling your family members, would you please watch when Harvest Season premieres in May? I mean, those are things that need to be put out there so we can see and appreciate all the work that these folks have been killing themselves to do for so many years. And going back to Jesus's time, when the only guy at West High School where I used to teach in Denver with a Super 8 camera. That is our collective history, and that needs to be seen and appreciated. The students that I teach in Denver don't know that it happened. And I cannot tell you how frustrating it is to have to constantly not only it's like you wear many hats, right? You're trying to create content, but at the same time you're trying to educate our own people about the content that's already there, and that we also need to share that, whether it's historical or whether it's more recent, by the rest of the panel.
Could I just ask, how can we stream Cesar's Last Feast?
Fast. It's now on iTunes, so you could just go to iTunes and watch Cesar's Last Feast. Yeah.
Okay.
I think all of this is to say, I think that every film has its own path, and so 20 years ago, we all kind of knew what the path was. It's like you wanted to get into Sundance, and then you wanted a national broadcast, and then you wanted international sales, and then you wanted DVD. I mean, it was not as murky as it is today. And so what I try to talk to filmmakers about is like, look at your film. Who are you trying to reach? We funded a PBS Frontline on kids trafficked from Central America in this country. And the idea with PBS Frontline is they get a big audience, but actually you just want to reach decision makers, right? People who can change legislation. That's perfect for that story. Somebody else might just want to do some community screenings, and that's right for that story. So I think it's neither, it's not one or the other. We need all of these opportunities. We need all of these funding streams. But in reality, filmmakers need to be honest about what their film can do, where it should go, and who it's going to reach, the people for whom it's going to have the most impact. And so that's just the reality. It's like not all films are created equal. They are not all going to have the same path. And actually, it's kind of exciting insofar as there's a lot more paths you can take now than there used to be.
Just more research involved.
Sure, it's just more strategy.
Right.
You need to be more strategic.
Yes.
So
we're about to open it up for questions for you all, so just hold on a second. But Wendy, please.
I just wanted to say quickly that because we are in this environment where we're having to work with streaming rights, and we know we can't compete with Netflix or Amazon, and that is a given. We just can't compete in terms of funding and what they can offer. But what we do offer is that you can have it both ways. You can have your film on PBS, and you can have your film on Netflix or Amazon. We always talk to filmmakers that you don't have to, you can have a public broadcasting life. Your film can live on both platforms. And we have been very creative in terms of making sure that those deals work, because we're not interested in making money off your film. We actually want you to make the money. So.
Was there one other?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because I think what's happening here is that you have we have students and other filmmakers in the audience, and then we have other people who are further along in their trajectory. So I kind of wanted to take a quick step backwards just to encourage people out there who are looking to do their own films and to be inspired and to kind of forget about the impossibilities. Let's just think about what's possible. And one of the things that I learned early in my career is that when you're doing a documentary or any form of nonfiction content, you have to check 3 boxes in order for it to be a great potential subject for a story. So just on practical terms, if you have unique characters is one facet. If you have a story where the stakes are high, that's the second facet. And then if you have unique access. So those are, it just as you're thinking of ideas that you want to develop, unique access meaning I want to do a documentary on Tiger Woods, but I don't know Tiger Woods, or I want to do a documentary on Tiger Woods and I know him. So that's an example of unique access. So just to encourage people out there that the barrier of entry is easier and lower than ever before. So don't be worried about the collapse of the documentary industry. And then one other thing is just, if you go when you are developing, you've checked all these 3 boxes, and you're developing your pitch, your proposal to try to get a first grant, maybe of $10,000 or $20,000. Just go and shoot this story for 3 or 4 days, edit together a 3 to 5 minute sizzle reel, put together a great proposal, ask for people who have proposals that you can model it after, and then off to the races. It's not impossible, I promise you. So I just wanted to encourage people out there.
Thank you very much. It's a good note of encouragement. Anybody have any questions for the panel at large or individuals?
Hello, can you hear me? My name is Gilbert Martinez. I'm a 5th generation Texan, and my family originated in El Paso in November 1834. Miss Ibarra, maybe we're related. I'm almost intimidated to address this great group, but I'd like to say that the Mexican brand, what is the Mexican brand as we hear it and know it nowadays? According to the payaso in the White House, we're all murderers, and we're rapists, and we're drug pushers, and we can't be judges, and anything negative you can think. Well, the real story behind who we are is totally opposite to that. And I think that this might tie in with Mr. Trevino. He's saying, how do we tell our story, our Latino story, which is the real true story, which we are just a great people. I'm a builder. I'm a retired banker, but I've been a builder for the last 20 years. I've built a lot of houses. And let me tell you, the fellow who clears the lot is Mexican. The fellows who pour the concrete are Mexicans. The truck driver who brings the dirt, his truck, he's a Mexican. The framer, they're all Mexicans. The roofer is a Mexican. The plumber is a Mexican. The painter is a Mexican. The guy that has an expensive machine that does all the plastering for the walls is a Mexican. Every one of them. Even when you get ready to sell the house, the people at the office where they're going to make the loan, most of them are Mexicans. So we just cover everything when it comes to both residential and commercial building. And without that industry, without those industries, this economy, our economy would be in the tank. And so what do we do in order to change our story to tell what we really do, what we really are? And Mr. Trevino, I think you might have one of the better ideas about what I'm saying.
Jesus, how are you going to fix the world?
Well, first of all, let me say that being born in EPT, we're homeboys, so I have to respond to you. You know, I would say that there's a diversity of ways in which we do it. I think all this panel here, this tremendous panel, reflects commercial and public television. It reflects independent and filmmakers and filmmakers who are tied to organizations. It reflects almost every conceivable way that a human being can figure out how to make his damn movie, you know? And I'm proud to see that all of these people have accomplished it in one way or another. They've found a way to tell our story. And I think that's the important thing, is to keep that, that prize, that eyes on that prize. The prize is our story. The prize is self-empowerment. The prize is us being who we are and letting America know it, and letting America know that we are part of it and we contribute to it, and we are totally a part of this nation, and that we're not the minorities, all the names they call us, as you're suggesting, what our president does to divert and chastise us and make us the victim. We are not the victims, we are the heroes. And I think everyone on this panel knows that and is working in their own way, their own creative way, to affirm that.
Thank you. And just to what the gentleman next to you said about not having our handout and going out on our own, the truck driver that I told you about that brings the dirt, he had to, those trucks cost $120,000, so he was able to borrow $60,000 to have his truck. And he spends about $80 in gas, in diesel every day. And when he has to put new tires on there, there's 18 tires that he has to change. Pay the insurance, pay all of that, and he still makes money. So we Mexicans are very, very entrepreneurial. And I think I agree with what you're saying, sir, about not having a handout and going out on our own. Thank you, gentlemen, very much.
Thank you. I think what I would add just briefly is that the documentary that I have coming out is called John Leguizamo's Road to Broadway, and it actually covers everything you're talking about, which is John put together a Broadway show where he decided to take 3,000 years of whitewashed Latin history and highlight it on Broadway against all odds. We were told it wasn't going to make money. We were told it wasn't going to be prestigious, and we ended up packing out the houses in Broadway for 6 months. We made money before every other Broadway show. I was one of the producers. We got nominated for a Tony. We just did a Netflix special that came out 3 days ago. That's Latin History for Morons. And then we have a documentary coming out on Friday on PBS about the process. So I think we're trying to do our part. Now, I think to speak to the audiences, we need you guys to do your part and support projects like this, because we literally just did an entire multi-million-dollar investment on highlighting Mexican stories like you talked about, the Gavez and the Cuban widows that helped fund the Revolutionary War and all kinds of untold stories. So support us, and we'll keep supporting our culture.
Let me look at my note. I just like the question about what's the Mexican story? I think that's a very good question, because I think it is pushing me to think about one of my agendas as a filmmaker is to break down like that dominant border story of who we are living, growing up and living in El Paso. A lot of us here have done so. It's just, it's something that it's a marginalized zone that's just even now today, it's erupted in this new way with the payaso that's in power, and so we're hearing about it again in these ways of as this really urgent space. And to me, it's also a place where we live and where we grow up. And to break down that dominant story, the idea is to have these different perspectives of where we come from. So So another person from El Paso is not going to tell you the same story that I'm going to tell you about the border. And I think to do that, I'm thinking about my own feeling of homelessness when it comes to where my films end up, because I have this tradition of, I have a home within PBS. I didn't know exactly where I would be ending up when I made my first film. I just I scraped it together out of the materials I could find, and it found a home in PBS. And then I kept making work with PBS in mind. And my question to myself is, how does that is there any kind of self-censorship there in the way that I'm putting these stories together? Because when I go out and collect these grants, it's like they're little breadcrumbs. If I start out with a PBS organization, all of my rights are now automatically with PBS. And that's for a small development grant. So my question is, how do I personally hybridize my fundraising approach so that I can also hybridize my storytelling approach? And I'm really resistant to that dominant story. It's one of my missions as a filmmaker to break that down. But those are the thoughts that came to my mind.
Hello, my name is Marlon Saucedo, and another thing that I wanted to address about specifically you being a builder or being involved in construction. There's I interned for a lady. Her name is Chelsea Hernandez, and she has made is producing in the middle of production of a film called Building the American Dream, and it's all about everything that you've talked about. And I think it should come out probably within a year or so. And I think everyone in this room should be looking for that film because it's a very important film, and it's based on both in Austin and Dallas, these two areas, and I think it'll be a very significant film. And also, Chelsea also worked under Hector Galan, and I now work under Hector Galan, and she was doing the same type of thing that you guys were calling for, which is trying to connect one another, trying to have each other's backs, and she definitely had my back, connecting me to Hector, and I'm super thankful for her. I think my question kind of surrounds working with Hector. It kind of has made me consider things that I hadn't considered while I was attending school here in UT, and also just as a side note, I'm very thankful to have been under the guidance of people like Maggie and Charles, and I'm super thankful for you too. You guys were very, very important in I think my formation and my appreciation for film and for journalism. And I think as a young filmmaker or storyteller or whatever term you might want to give it, I think it's a little daunting, especially a person my age who doesn't feel very represented, and has a certain pressure that I'm not being active enough, or I'm not being what I have to say isn't being loud enough, or my question is kind of is it maybe time for documentary film to go through some type of recreation in terms of maybe marketing, or in terms of any other venue, so that it's either more I'm going to put it frankly, because I feel as though conversations that I've had with people my age who aren't so interested in documentary or aren't so interested in facts, I think is it time for it to go through a different image or something to really outreach to younger generation, or even filmmakers who are my age who are wanting to take that in move into the industry.
One thing I can think of just offhand is a friend of mine in Denver is developing a series that it looks like it's scripted, but the characters are actually playing themselves. But the style is this hybrid thing. It's not all of one and it's not all of the other. Commercially, it is difficult. He has found that it's commercially it's a difficult sell, because he can't get into a documentary festival because it looks like it's scripted, and he can't get into a scripted festival or a scripted section because it's documentary. And I mean, I appreciate what you're saying because teaching young people, yeah, I mean, a lot of the times that you know, a lot of the traditional ways of documentary filmmaking are not necessarily things that attract a younger audience. But at the same time, I can show them 30 for 30s, and they're enthralled, but which are not necessarily about, you know, your film just happens to be about baseball, but it's about all these other things, whether it's politics or whether it's family, and that's what I noticed that young kids can, or a younger audience, a different audience can connect to also. It's just a matter of mining and figuring out what that connective tissue is with docs that are being made.
I would just tell your friend that they're not watching enough documentaries, because there's an incredible wealth of films out there of every type. I mean, you know, you want a murder mystery, you want a personal story, you want an essay film, you want a political film, social issue films, and the approach to each and every one of them is as diverse as, you know, as the people in this room. I think it's important to seek them out, and sometimes maybe they don't quite reach people for whatever reason, but to paint them as these, you know, these factual documentaries is just not the reality of what's out there. Doc series, I mean, you name it. I would just encourage you to seek to tell your friend to seek them out more, not just in the traditional platforms, but in film festivals, and, you know, in other places where you might not, you know, you might not look. People are, you know, watching old documentaries on Fandor, for example, or the, you know, soon-to-be defunct Filmstruck. There's just tons of stuff.
I think something that I've noticed is, like, industries. Sorry, what?
3 more minutes and the program is
Industries like reality television have like been very really influential for my generation, and that seems to like really warp what's real and what isn't, and it's kind of destructive.
Bernardo was talking about before, that there is a difference between, you know, what is it, factual entertainment you called it, you know, and actual documentary films.
We have time for one more question.
I want to go back to what Christina briefly mentioned in her response. When you're talking about the director or the producer's voice in independent filmmaking, how are you making sure, for those of you who have been in independent filmmaking, how are you making sure that your voice or your opinion is representative of the demographic that you're trying to portray to an audience?
I would love for anyone else to jump in here. I mean, but I don't approach the work thinking about demographics. I approach it by thinking about how can I see myself, right? And so I guess because I am one of the demographics that's mostly invisible in a lot of ways, it just ends up, you know, that's, I guess, what the themes of the work naturally bring up those questions. But I feel like framing a story around, like, how can I hit the most people, I feel like it might be the backwards way of looking at it, because in order to reach a mass audience, I've found in my work that it's by being specific to your own experience. The more specific that you can be to you, because my films are very personal. I'm sure everyone can speak to it in a different way, but I feel like that's how I can really translate that experience to a wide audience. So it's not by trying to be universal, but it's the opposite. And I feel like that's how demographics get represented.
So one of the things that she said in the interview yesterday was one of the things she discovered making films was the more specific she became, ironically, the more universal it seemed to appeal. And so, you know, a 30 for 30, the more it's about baseball, the more it's about race and culture and discrimination. And, you know, it's a fascinating reality. So, you know, one of the realities is don't be afraid to be specific. There's a way in which the human condition will be represented.
One more thing is, and this is a little bit off point. When I heard that the Raul Julia story was being told in American Masters, I was fucking thrilled. I'm sorry. I was just, I cannot believe it. I cannot believe it because I'm sorry. Please, anyway, because I admired Raul Julia. What a wonderful character. And I teach at Berkeley, and I have a Latino film series of classes, and we showed Romero. And people said, who's this Raul Julia guy? And I went down the list and I said, well, you know, he's also Gomez on the Addams Family. And all of a sudden, that class just perked up. So what's happening, it's this process of discovery or rediscovery in this case, that because you're making this wonderful film, getting it in American masses, which is about the only place that you could, that I think in PBS that it really, you get the exposure that it belongs, is this process of you're bringing to a new generation the story of this wonderful actor that has, I mean, classically trained. Yeah, I mean, it's, and that's what I think find exciting is the fact is that this story finally gets told of, and a whole new generation discovers who Raul Julia was, not only as an actor, but as an activist. Yes, that's right. And all the many, as many different aspects of him, a stage actor, and television actor, film actor. I mean, I'm just, what makes me excited is to hear the stories that you guys are making, and especially this one. I'm sorry. Thank you. Well,
I would just add, like, if he was just an actor who was talented, it wouldn't have been enough. But and if he was just Gomez, it wouldn't have been enough. But once you see the story, you'll understand this guy transcended being an actor. He was incredible humanitarian, incredible activist, one of the top Shakespearean actors of all time with a heavy Puerto Rican accent and never changed it, and is one of the greats of all time. So that's why I'm telling this story. He's a celebrity, but there's so much more.
Thank you.
Ben's really good at promoting his work, isn't he?
It is time to say goodbye. I want to leave you with this one thing. If you don't think that you're on our database, we have a database and we send out emails to people when we have at events, and also sometimes we send out mailings for particular things. We have index cards on the table out here, so fill out the index card, just put all your contact information, and we'll add you to our database and we'll keep you notified. And the other thing is we have a Voces kind of celebration cake, so I hope you'll join us for some of that. Thank you all so much.